When I opened the envelope, my hands were already trembling with a sense of anticipation I could not quite explain. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday in early December, enclosed in a padded envelope with no return address and a postmark from somewhere in Massachusetts. The package bore the weight of intention, not merely paper and cardstock, but something heavier, something that suggested the sender had taken considerable time to ensure its arrival and preservation. I almost discarded it immediately. My department receives dozens of unsolicited historical materials each month, most of them either misdirected or of marginal historical significance. But something in the care with which this envelope had been wrapped, the deliberate handwriting on the address label, suggested that this was different. Someone had determined that this specific package needed to reach this specific historian. Someone had apparently waited for the right moment to reveal what was inside. Inside was a single photograph, perhaps 4 by 6 inches, mounted on aged cardstock that bore the patina of careful preservation across decades. The image showed a man in his early 40s, positioned at a desk in what appeared to be an industrial or technical workspace, the kind of setting that suggested serious professional work, important technical projects, significant responsibility. The photograph was dated on the back in careful handwriting, the kind of script that suggests someone taking time to ensure absolute clarity. March 1943, Peenemünde, before everything changed. And beneath the date, underlined with deliberate emphasis, a single word that would drive my research for the following 2 years: forgive. The man's face struck me immediately as remarkable, primarily for its deceptive ordinariness. He wore a white shirt, rolled at the sleeves in a gesture suggesting both professionalism and comfort in his working environment. His hair was receding slightly, graying at the temples, visible evidence of a man in middle age who had apparently weathered stress and time. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that suggested an intellectual or technical occupation, the kind of glasses worn by people accustomed to studying detailed technical drawings, precise calculations, complicated mathematical formulations. His expression was composed into what appeared to be a smile, not forced, not the artificial smile of official documentation, but something closer to genuine contentment. He was smiling at the camera with the confidence of a man comfortable in his professional environment, apparently secure in his position, apparently proud of his technical contributions, apparently at ease within his workspace. But it was the photograph's setting, the background details, that arrested my attention with an almost physical force, that made my skin prickle with the recognition that I was looking at something historically significant, something that had been deliberately preserved across 8 decades, waiting for the moment when it could safely be revealed. Behind the man, visible on the desk and scattered across the shelves positioned behind the work surface, were documents of obvious technical significance, technical drawings, blueprints visible in the characteristic blue and white of architectural documentation, mathematical equations written on papers stacked haphazardly, the kind of calculations that suggest complex engineering problems. Visible on the wall directly behind his right shoulder was a photograph of something mechanical, something cylindrical and purposeful, something that appeared to suggest trajectory and velocity, something that looked unmistakably like a weapon system. And there, on the desk itself, positioned directly behind the man's right shoulder in a location that seemed both deliberate and almost casual, was a model. A detailed prototype model of something cylindrical, something engineered with obvious precision, something that resembled, in its proportions, its design, its mechanical suggestions, a rocket. I turned the photograph over and examined the handwriting on the back again, my eyes returning repeatedly to those 2 words, Peenemünde and forgive. I knew that name with the certainty of a historian who had spent years studying the Second World War. Peenemünde was not simply any location. It was the location of Nazi Germany's primary rocket development facility, the place where Werner von Braun and his team of technical professionals had conducted the systematic research that eventually led to the development of the V-2 rocket, one of the most sophisticated weapon systems of the Nazi regime. It was the facility that would eventually become the target of one of the most significant bombing campaigns of the entire war, RAF Operation Hydra, in August 1943, which would devastate the facility, destroy irreplaceable research, kill over 700 workers, and set back the weapons program by months. The man in this photograph was not simply an engineer. He was apparently an engineer working at Peenemünde in March 1943, 6 months before the catastrophic bombing campaign, 5 months before the aerial assault designed to destroy Nazi Germany's rocket program. He was apparently sitting at his desk, surrounded by visible evidence of his technical work on weapons systems, apparently content, apparently proud, apparently comfortable with his role and his responsibilities. And someone had taken the care to preserve this photograph, apparently carrying it through 80 years of history, apparently waiting for the moment when it could be revealed to someone who would understand its significance. Someone had sent me this photograph with a single word attached: forgive. The implications were overwhelming, pressing down upon me like physical weight. This was not a propaganda photograph, not an official Nazi document designed for public consumption or bureaucratic record-keeping. This was apparently a private photograph, preserved deliberately, apparently protected and hidden for 8 decades, now revealed to me with a request for forgiveness. But forgiveness for what? Who was asking for forgiveness? What was the nature of the transgression that had apparently required such a long silence before being revealed to history? What complicity did this photograph document? What moral compromise did it preserve? I set the photograph on my desk beneath my reading lamp and studied it with the kind of intensity that suggests obsession beginning to form. The obsession of a historian recognizing a puzzle that demanded to be solved. The man's smile, the technical drawings visible in the background, the model of what appeared to be a rocket system, the word Peenemünde indicating the location, and that single, almost desperate instruction: forgive. These elements would not cohere into easy understanding. They demanded investigation. They demanded context. They demanded that I venture into historical territory that felt both compelling and deeply troubling. I understood with absolute certainty that I was being asked to participate in the revelation of a historical secret that had been deliberately concealed. I understood that someone, likely a descendant of this man, had made the conscious decision that the time had finally come to reveal something that had been carefully hidden, carefully protected, carefully preserved across 8 decades. But I did not yet understand what that secret was, what crime or complicity or moral compromise had led to the preservation of this photograph for so long, waiting through the decades for the moment when it could safely be seen, when history might have sufficient distance to examine it with appropriate complexity. I reached for my phone and called colleagues at universities specializing in the detailed history of Nazi Germany and the technical dimensions of the Second World War. And I understood that I was about to embark on a journey of historical reconstruction that would force me to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between scientific genius and moral responsibility, about the ways that ordinary people participate in extraordinary systems of violence, about the persistent question of complicity and conscience that haunts everyone who studies this period of history. Over the following weeks, I subjected the photograph to every form of archival analysis available to contemporary historical research. I obtained high-resolution digital scans through multiple passes of precise scanning equipment. I consulted with specialized photographic experts about the film stock used, the camera that had captured the image, the specific printing process that had created the original from which I was examining a copy. I examined the technical drawings visible in the background through successive levels of magnification, first at 2x magnification, then at 5x, then at progressively higher levels, attempting to determine precisely what engineering specifications they documented. I studied the model positioned on the desk with particular intensity, comparing its proportions and its design characteristics against known engineering specifications for rocket systems that had been in development at Peenemünde during the 1943 period. What emerged from this careful, methodical examination was both clarifying and deeply troubling, information that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it into easy understanding. The technical drawings visible in the background of the photograph appeared to document design specifications for advanced rocket guidance systems, the kind of systems that would allow weapons to reach their targets with improved accuracy. The mathematical formulations visible on the paper scattered across the workspace suggested calculations related to trajectory planning, velocity analysis, and the complex physics of ballistic systems. The model on the desk, examined through high-resolution scanning and compared against historical engineering documentation, appeared to be a prototype or demonstration model of the V-2 rocket in advanced stages of development at Peenemünde, the legendary weapon system that would eventually become Nazi Germany's most sophisticated terror weapon, launched against London and Antwerp in the final months of the war, killing thousands of civilians in systematic aerial bombardment. But what arrested my attention most profoundly, what demanded explanation and generated new questions faster than I could formulate them, was a small detail that became visible only when I examined extremely high-resolution digital scans at significant magnification through specialized computer analysis. On the desk, partially obscured by scattered papers and technical materials, was something that appeared to be a photograph or a letter, the image quality insufficient for me to read any specific text that might have been visible. But the positioning of this item was not accidental. It was deliberately placed in a location where it would be visible to the camera operator. It was positioned so that anyone examining the photograph carefully would eventually notice it. This suggested intention. This suggested that the man being photographed had ensured that this particular item would be preserved in the image. I consulted with Dr. Heinrich Müller at the University of Hamburg, a specialist in the detailed history of Nazi technical development and the complicated lives of German engineers during the Second World War. When I showed him high-resolution scans of the photograph, his response was immediate and emotional. His face had gone pale. His hand had trembled slightly as he held the scans. He had stared at the image for a very long time without speaking, his eyes moving slowly across the details, the technical drawings, the mathematical notations, the model of the rocket system, and that small, mysterious item on the desk that suggested something more than simple professional documentation. "This is extraordinary," he had finally said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. "This is documentation of something that the post-war historical record has largely ignored or deliberately minimized. Do you understand what you're showing me? Do you understand the implications of this image?" I had explained that I was attempting to identify the man in the photograph, to understand the historical significance of the image, to determine why it had apparently been preserved in secret for 80 years and why it was now being revealed. "The V-2 program," Dr. Müller had said slowly, his words measured and deliberate, was staffed by engineers and scientists of varying degrees of ideological complicity and moral awareness. Some were true believers in Nazi ideology. Some were opportunists who had chosen to advance their careers through participation in weapons development. Some were people who simply wanted to work on technically interesting problems and who deliberately ignored or minimized the weapons applications of their work. But all of them, and this is crucial, all of them knew at some level what they were contributing to. All of them understood that their work was being directed toward the creation of weapons that would be used against civilian populations. All of them possessed some degree of consciousness about their participation. He had pointed directly to the photograph with visible emotion. This man, whoever he is, was apparently acutely aware of this reality. Look at his expression carefully. Look at the specific details he chose to include in this photograph. He's not simply documenting his work as a matter of routine professional record-keeping. He's deliberately documenting something about his own consciousness of what he was doing. He's preserving evidence of his knowledge, evidence of his participation, evidence of his complicity. And then he apparently spent the rest of his life carrying this photograph, waiting apparently for someone to understand what it meant, waiting for the moment when it could safely be revealed. Over the following months, I began systematically searching for information about German engineers who had worked at Peenemünde during 1943 and who had survived both the bombing campaign and the post-war period. The facility had employed approximately 5,000 people at its operational peak. Many had been killed in the devastating August 1943 bombing raid. Many had been evacuated to other facilities as the war progressed and the situation deteriorated. Some had survived the war entirely, had been processed through the complex post-war systems, had relocated to various countries, had rebuilt lives in the post-war period. The photograph itself provided multiple clues. The quality of the image, the type of film stock used, the style of the desk and workspace, the general aesthetic of the composition, all suggested this was not an official Nazi documentation photograph created by state apparatus. This appeared to be a personal photograph, taken by someone with access to the facility and to photographic equipment, Someone trusted enough to move freely within the workspace. Someone with the freedom and the desire to document a colleague in his workspace. Someone who apparently understood the significance of what they were documenting. I began cross-referencing the physical appearance of the man in the photograph against known photographs of Peenemünde engineers and technicians who had survived the war. The resemblance was not immediately obvious. The quality of the image was insufficient for certain facial recognition using contemporary digital technology. But combined with the provenance information, Massachusetts postmark suggesting American connection, the historical context, March 1943 at Peenemünde, and the mysterious, almost pleading request for forgiveness, I began constructing a framework of investigative possibility. The breakthrough in my investigation came through an unexpected source, a retired archivist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology named Dr. by Eleanor Vasquez, who contacted me after learning about my research through a shared colleague working in the field of military history and technical documentation. She explained that MIT maintained an extensive collection of materials related to German scientists and engineers who had immigrated to the United States after the Second World War, including comprehensive biographical materials, personal correspondence, technical papers, and family histories. "There's a man," she had said carefully over the phone, her voice suggesting she understood the significance of what she was about to share, who arrived in America in 1950 under one of the technical sponsorship programs that recruited German technical personnel for the American military-industrial establishment. His name was Klaus Hoffmann. He was an engineer at Peenemünde during the war. Specifically, he worked on guidance systems for the V-2 rocket, the guidance mechanisms that would determine accuracy and trajectory. After the war, he apparently carried significant guilt about his work on weapon systems. He became a professor of engineering at MIT, where he taught for 40 years. He was apparently a brilliant engineer in terms of technical capability, but he was also apparently a thoughtful man who spent much of his later life thinking about the ethical dimensions of technical work. She had paused, allowing that information to settle. His granddaughter contacted our archives several years ago. She was researching her grandfather's history, attempting to understand who he had been during the war and how that wartime experience had shaped his post-war life. She left a note with the archives asking if anyone ever inquired about a specific photograph, a photograph of her grandfather at his desk at Peenemünde in 1943. She said if someone did inquire, she wanted them to have access to materials that would help explain the photograph, that would provide context for understanding what it documented and why it had been preserved. Dr. Vasquez provided me with direct contact information for Klaus Hoffmann's granddaughter, Sarah Chen, who lived in Boston and who worked as a historian in her own right. When I called her, there was immediate recognition in her voice, the recognition of someone who had been waiting for this contact, who had apparently anticipated that eventually a historian would find the photograph and would seek explanation. "You found it," she had said without preamble. "You found the photograph my grandfather preserved for his entire life. I've been waiting for a historian to contact me. I've been waiting for someone to come seeking explanation. My grandfather made me promise that when the time was right, I would help explain the photograph, that I would provide context for understanding it. I think that time has finally come. I think the world is ready to understand what it means." Sarah and I arranged to meet in Boston, in a quiet cafe near the MIT campus where her grandfather had spent 40 years of his life teaching and attempting to atone for his wartime complicity. She brought with her a collection of materials that her grandfather had apparently preserved with great care: journals spanning decades, personal letters, technical notes, photographs, and most importantly, the original photograph itself in its pristine condition, protected across 80 years. When she laid out these materials on the cafe table, the weight of history seemed almost tangible. The original photograph was indeed the one I had been examining, the same image showing Klaus at his desk at Peenemünde in March 1943, the same smile containing complex emotional layers, the same visible evidence of his technical work on weapon systems, but alongside the photograph were materials that provided crucial context and explanation. Klaus Hoffmann had maintained journals throughout his entire life, beginning during his time at Peenemünde in 1942-1943, and continuing through his long life in America until his death in 1998. Sarah had brought carefully selected entries from these journals, photocopied and organized chronologically, that documented Klaus's internal moral struggle and his conscious awareness of his complicity in weapons development. An entry from March 1943 read, "I have been at Peenemünde for 8 months now. My work on guidance systems is progressing well. The mathematics is elegant. The engineering challenges are significant and intellectually interesting. The precision required in these calculations approaches the level of art. Today, I was promoted to senior engineer. My colleagues congratulated me. My supervisor praised my contributions, but I cannot shake the persistent knowledge that sits beneath all of this professional success. This elegant mathematics, this challenging engineering, is being directed toward the creation of weapons that will kill people, weapons designed to terrorize civilian populations. I asked myself today, as I do most days, am I complicit? Am I responsible? Does the elegance of the technical problem absolve me of moral responsibility for the applications of that problem?" Another entry from April 1943 documented a conversation with a colleague. "I had a conversation today with Otto, one of my colleagues, who said something that has haunted me throughout the day. He said, 'If we don't do this work, someone else will do it. If we don't develop these weapons, the enemy will develop them first. Therefore, our work is justified. It's not evil. It's necessary. I understand the logic perfectly. I find it unconvincing. I find myself increasingly unable to separate the technical from the ethical. I cannot solve a problem without considering what that problem will ultimately be used for.'" And then, from May 1943, the entry that apparently prompted the creation of the photograph. "I asked Otto to take a photograph of me at my desk. I want to preserve this moment. I want to preserve evidence of who I was, what I was doing, what I was allowing myself to participate in. I'm deliberately including in the background everything that defines my work, the technical drawings, the models, the evidence of my contribution to the weapons program. I'm doing this because I suspect that history will eventually ask questions about people like me. History will want to understand what we knew, what we chose to ignore, what we prioritized over moral consideration, and I want there to be evidence. I want there to be testimony. I want future generations to be able to understand what we knew and how we lived with that knowledge." Sarah explained that Klaus had made a deliberate, conscious decision to create this photograph as a kind of visual confession, a testimony to his own complicity in the Nazi weapons program. The photograph was not meant for public consumption during the war. It was meant for history. It was meant to preserve evidence of his own consciousness of what he was doing, his awareness of the consequences, his understanding that he was contributing to weapons designed to kill people. Peenemünde, Germany, 1942-1943. The technical heart of Nazi rocket development where brilliance and complicity converged. Klaus Hoffmann had not expected to become a weapons engineer. In another timeline, in a world where the Second World War had not happened, where Europe had not descended into systematic violence and totalitarian ideology, Klaus would have spent his career teaching engineering at a university, a career characterized by the pursuit of technical problems with the confidence of a man working in a peaceful context, with the assurance that his work would contribute to human knowledge and human flourishing rather than to human destruction. But the war had come, as it came to so many. Conscription had come as it came to millions of young men who had no particular political commitment to Nazi ideology, but who found themselves drafted into military service nonetheless. And Klaus had found himself assigned to Peenemünde in July 1942, selected apparently because of his technical capabilities, assigned to work among 5,000 other technical professionals working on the rocket program that Nazi Germany believed, or at minimum, that Nazi leadership hoped, would eventually deliver decisive military victory. Klaus was 27 years old when he arrived at Peenemünde. He was brilliant in the way that technically sophisticated people are brilliant, able to perceive elegant mathematical solutions to complex engineering problems, able to work comfortably with abstract calculations and mechanical systems, able to contribute significantly to large collaborative projects, even when those projects operated within oppressive hierarchies. He could see possibilities in technical challenges that others missed. He could solve problems that seemed intractable. He could advance projects through sheer intellectual force. But Klaus was also thoughtful in ways that were perhaps dangerous during wartime. He was reflective. He questioned. He considered multiple perspectives. He was uncomfortable with simple narratives and easy justifications. He was someone for whom the moral dimensions of the war could not be easily compartmentalized away from the technical dimensions, someone for whom ethical considerations persisted even when systems demanded that he ignore them. Peenemünde itself was a city designed entirely around technical work, constructed specifically to serve as the research and development center for Nazi Germany's most advanced weapons program. Thousands of engineers and scientists worked in research facilities, in development workshops, in manufacturing areas, in administrative offices. The facility was organized with characteristic German precision, each person assigned to specific tasks, each task understood to be essential to the larger project of developing rockets that would allegedly transform the war and ensure German military victory. Klaus had been assigned to work on guidance systems, the technologies and the calculations that would allow the V-2 rockets under development to reach their targets with some degree of accuracy and precision. It was technically sophisticated work, demanding multiple skill sets operating simultaneously. It required mathematical sophistication at the highest levels. It required engineering skill that transcended routine problem-solving. It required the ability to think about complex problems at multiple scales simultaneously, from individual components to entire systems, to how systems might interact with other systems. Klaus was good at this work. He was promoted repeatedly. He was recognized by his supervisors as a rising star in the program, as someone whose capabilities were exceptional even among the assembled technical talent. But with each promotion came greater awareness of the ultimate purpose of his work. With each technical problem solved came the persistent understanding that he was solving these problems in direct service of weapons development. With each advancement in his career came the knowledge that his advancement was an advancement in weapons technology that would eventually be used against people, against military targets certainly, but increasingly against civilian populations in what had come to be understood as psychological warfare. Klaus kept a small room in the residential quarters of Peenemünde, a modest space allocated to senior engineers. It contained a bed, a desk, a shelf of books that he had collected or that had been available. In this room, in the evenings after work, when the technical challenges had been temporarily set aside and the pressing demands of the weapons program had receded somewhat, Klaus would write in his journal. He would attempt to process the moral conflict that intensified with each passing month. Each technical problem solved, each promotion received. He would read philosophy, Kant, Hegel, German thinkers who had grappled with questions of individual responsibility within larger systems, with questions of conscience operating within structures designed to eliminate conscience. He would attempt to construct philosophical frameworks that might allow him to understand his own complicity, to find some way of living with what he was doing without completely abandoning his own sense of himself as a moral being. The breakthrough, or perhaps the breakdown, in Klaus's moral awareness came in January 1943, when he was assigned to a classified briefing that detailed the weapons applications of the V-2 rocket program. Until this point, Klaus had maintained a degree of intellectual distance from the concrete consequences of his work. He could tell himself that he was solving interesting technical problems, that the applications were not his direct concern, that he was simply contributing to a larger military effort that was presumably, according to official narrative, necessary for German survival. He could compartmentalize. He could separate the technical from the ethical. But the briefing made clear, with unmistakable clarity, that the V-2 was being designed specifically as a terror weapon. It was to be launched against London. It was to be used to terrorize the British civilian population into surrender. It was to be an instrument of psychological warfare as much as military warfare, perhaps even primarily psychological warfare. The precision guidance systems that Klaus was working on would increase the accuracy of the weapon, would improve its effectiveness as a terror instrument, would ensure that a greater percentage of the rockets reached their targets, and caused maximum destruction. Klaus had felt physically ill during and after this briefing. He had gone to his room and had written an entry in his journal that suggested he was approaching some kind of fundamental moral crisis, some kind of breaking point in his ability to maintain his internal equilibrium. Peenemünde, 1943. Klaus Hoffmann makes a decision that will define the rest of his life. By March 1943, Klaus had resolved to do something that both terrified and clarified him, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, but which he apparently understood was necessary to maintain any sense of himself as a moral being. He would preserve evidence of his own complicity. He would create a visual testimony to the fact that he had known what he was doing. He had understood the consequences of his work. He had participated anyway. He would make this knowledge visible, preserved in a photograph that might someday be seen by history. He had approached his colleague Otto, a photographer who worked part-time documenting technical processes at the Peenemünde facility as part of the administrative documentation system, and had asked if Otto would be willing to take a photograph of him at his desk. Otto had been curious about the request, as it was somewhat unusual. Professional photographs were typically taken for official purposes, for inclusion in documentation or reports. Personal photographs were less common in a military facility where every moment was supposed to be directed toward the war effort. But Otto had apparently understood something in Klaus's manner, something in the way he asked, that suggested this request carried significance beyond the routine. Otto had agreed. Klaus had carefully arranged his workspace to include visible evidence of his work, not in a way that seemed obviously staged, but in a way that appeared natural and professional. The technical drawings he had positioned on the desk and on nearby shelves, blueprints showing the guidance system specifications, the mathematical calculations he had placed where they would be visible to the camera, equations documenting his work, his contributions, his technical achievements. The models of the weapon systems under development he had positioned prominently, documentary evidence of what he was working on, what he was contributing to, and then deliberately, in a gesture that suggested his consciousness of what he was doing, he had included something else, something deeply personal. On his desk, positioned so that it would be visible to the camera but not immediately obvious to a casual observer, he had placed a photograph of his family, a photograph of his wife, who was waiting for him in Berlin, who had no knowledge of the detailed technical work he was engaged in, who represented everything that existed independent of Peenemünde and weapons development and the war. A photograph that was evidence of his life before Peenemünde, evidence of his identity as something other than simply a weapons engineer, evidence of connections and relationships that transcended military systems. Klaus had positioned himself at his desk. He had composed his expression carefully. His smile was not genuine, it was professional, controlled, the smile of a man comfortable in his role and confident in his position. But the smile also contained something else, something subtle but undeniable to anyone who examined it carefully. The smile also contained tension, internal conflict, the suggestion of someone maintaining composure while wrestling internally with profound moral distress. And then Otto had taken the photograph. The camera had clicked. The moment had been captured. The evidence had been preserved. When Klaus examined the developed print several days later, he understood that he had captured something important, something that transcended simple documentation. The photograph documented his participation in the weapons program, but it also documented his consciousness of that participation. The photograph was evidence. It was testimony. It was a letter addressed to an unknown future, asking the future to judge him and understand him and, perhaps ultimately, to forgive him for what he had done and what he had allowed himself to participate in. Klaus had written his famous unsent letter that same month in March 1943, in a response to an internal moral crisis that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. He was living in a state of perpetual internal conflict, a psychological state characterized by constant tension. He was solving technical problems while simultaneously knowing that those problems were being solved in direct service of weapons development. He was advancing in his career, while simultaneously understanding that his advancement was an advancement in the machinery of systematic warfare. He was receiving praise and recognition from his superiors, while simultaneously feeling that he was contributing to something fundamentally wrong. He had considered resistance. He had considered various ways of sabotaging his own work, of deliberately introducing errors into the guidance systems, of finding ways to undermine the weapons program from within his position as a senior engineer. But he understood clearly, without illusion, that such actions would likely result in discovery, court-martial, and execution. He was not courageous enough, or perhaps not convinced enough of the absolute necessity of resistance, to sacrifice his own life for his principles. This knowledge itself became a source of additional guilt. So he had done what seemed possible. He had preserved the photograph. He had written the unsent letter, the letter that would remain private, that would not be sent to anyone, that would simply exist as a testimony to his own consciousness of what he was doing. He had created evidence that he had known what he was doing. He had created testimony that could be consulted by history. He had apparently decided that he would spend the rest of his life attempting to atone for that participation through different kinds of work and different kinds of living. When the RAF bombed Peenemünde on August 17, 1943, in Operation Hydra, one of the most significant bombing campaigns of the war, Klaus had experienced the complex mixture of emotions he had written about in his unsent letter: relief that the weapons program might be disrupted, perhaps even stopped; grief at the deaths of over 700 colleagues, people he had worked alongside, people he had known personally in some cases; and underneath all of it, the persistent, inescapable knowledge that even if the program was destroyed in this moment, even if the war ended tomorrow, he would carry the responsibility of his participation for the rest of his life. The bombing could not undo what he had done. Death of colleagues could not absolve him of his complicity. The weapons program was not stopped. It was relocated to underground facilities at Nordhausen. Klaus was transferred there in September 1943. He continued working on guidance systems. He continued contributing to the development of weapons that would eventually kill thousands of people, primarily British and Belgian civilians in the final months of the war, killed by V-2 rockets whose guidance systems Klaus had helped design. But in his mind, Klaus carried the photograph, and he carried the knowledge that he had created evidence of his own consciousness. He carried the understanding that he had, at minimum, borne witness to his own complicity. Klaus Hoffmann survived the Second World War. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945, at the end of the European campaign, and was processed through the complex and often contradictory systems that the American military had established for German engineers and scientists. Because he had not been a Nazi Party member, and because his technical expertise was considered valuable to the emerging American military-industrial establishment, he was eventually cleared for immigration to the United States under the Technical Personnel Recruitment Program. This program, sometimes controversial even at the time, had the objective of recruiting German technical talent for American military and industrial purposes while simultaneously preventing that talent from falling into Soviet hands. In 1950, Klaus Hoffmann and his wife Mary immigrated to America. They settled in Boston, Massachusetts. Klaus was hired as a professor of mechanical engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He spent the next 48 years teaching courses in mechanical engineering and technical design, in systems thinking and complex problem solving. But what distinguished Klaus's teaching from that of his many colleagues was his persistent, almost obsessive emphasis on the ethical dimensions of technical work. His students, literally hundreds of them over the course of his long career, remembered him as a professor who was unusual in his consistent insistence that technical problems could not be separated from ethical considerations. He would frequently pause in the middle of technical instruction to ask his students moral questions, questions that were not part of any standard engineering curriculum. If you were designing a system that could be used for either civilian benefit or weapons application, what would you do? If you were working in a context where your government was requesting technical contributions to weapons development, how would you respond? What is your responsibility as a technical professional? Where does your responsibility end and someone else's responsibility begin? These were not questions that standard engineering education typically addressed. Most engineering instruction focused on technical problems in isolation, independent of their applications or their ethical dimensions. But Klaus brought ethics to every class, every lecture, every assignment, every student conference. He would integrate ethical considerations into every aspect of his teaching, refusing to allow his students to compartmentalize technical work from ethical implications. His colleagues had initially been somewhat dismissive of his approach. Technical work was technical work, they argued. Ethics was something that belonged to philosophers and theologians and ethicists, not to engineers. But over time, As Klaus's reputation grew, as his students began speaking about the profound impact his teaching had on their professional consciousness and their life decisions, as Klaus's work began influencing engineering education more broadly, his approach began to be recognized as pioneering and important. By the 1980s, Klaus had become known nationally and internationally as one of the pioneers of engineering ethics education. Universities began inviting him to speak about the relationship between technical work and moral responsibility. Textbooks began incorporating his ideas about the ways that ethical consciousness needs to be integrated into technical training. He was, in a profound sense, atoning for his participation in Peenemünde through his commitment to teaching future engineers to think carefully about the ethical implications of their work. But Klaus never spoke publicly about Peenemünde. He never identified himself in any public forum as someone who had worked on weapons development. He maintained his privacy about his wartime experience. He maintained the photograph and the unsent letter in a drawer beside his bed, apparently examining them periodically throughout his life, apparently using them as a kind of private meditation on complicity and conscience. The photograph became his private ritual, a way of maintaining connection to his own consciousness of what he had done. His wife, Mary, apparently understood the weight that Klaus carried. She recognized that her husband was a man living with profound guilt and attempting to construct meaning and purpose through his teaching work and through his commitment to ethics education. She apparently supported his silence about his past. She apparently encouraged his commitment to ensuring that future generations of technical professionals would think differently, more carefully, more ethically about the implications of their work. When I analyzed the archival records and the historical documents that Klaus had preserved throughout his life, I discovered that he had apparently maintained secret correspondence with a small circle of other German engineers who had worked on weapons programs during the war. These letters, carefully preserved in the MIT archives, suggested that Klaus was part of an informal network of technically skilled Germans who had carried guilt about their wartime work and who had made deliberate choices to contribute to post-war ethics and education. One letter from a physicist who had worked on nuclear weapons research at another German facility expressed this sentiment. "Klaus, I understand completely what you are doing. I am doing something very similar. We were all complicit. We cannot undo that complicity, but perhaps we can ensure that future generations of technical professionals think differently. Perhaps we can teach them that conscience matters, that ethical responsibility cannot be separated from technical work, that if you participate in systems of violence, you carry that participation forever. This is our atonement, I think. This is all we have to offer the future." Klaus had apparently considered writing a public memoir of his Peenemünde experience. He had apparently drafted sections of such a memoir, according to materials Sarah discovered in his papers, but he had apparently decided against publication, apparently determining that his responsibility was to his students and to ethics education, rather than to the broader historical record. His story, he apparently believed, could only have value if it contributed to changing how technical professionals thought about their work, if it influenced engineering education, if it shaped the consciousness of future generations who would face similar ethical choices. When Klaus died in 1998 at the age of 83, his obituary in the MIT Community newsletter mentioned his pioneering work in engineering ethics. It described him as a dedicated teacher who had profoundly influenced several generations of engineers. It did not mention Peenemünde. It did not mention his work on weapons systems. It described him as someone who had dedicated his life to helping engineers think about the moral implications of their work. But Sarah Chen, his granddaughter, had inherited the photograph and the journals and the unsent letter, and she had apparently made the conscious decision that after a sufficient interval had passed, after enough historical distance had accumulated, the story needed to be told to the broader historical record, not to diminish Klaus's post-war accomplishments in ethics education, but to contextualize them, to help people understand that Klaus's passionate commitment to ethics education was not abstract theorizing, but rather the product of personal experience, personal complicity, personal guilt, and personal determination to ensure that others would make different choices than he had made. Some photographs capture more than faces. They hold the moment when an individual human being becomes consciously aware of their own complicity in a system designed to produce violence and destruction. This image, taken in March 1943 at Peenemünde in Nazi Germany, preserves within its frame a testament to the possibility of moral consciousness persisting even within the machinery of totalitarian warfare and weapons development. Klaus Hoffmann was not a monster. He was not a committed Nazi ideologue with deep ideological commitment to Nazi racism or Nazi warfare. He was an ordinary person, a technically skilled ordinary person, who had been conscripted into a system that demanded his participation in weapons development. He was someone who wanted to solve interesting technical problems, who was intellectually engaged by complex engineering challenges. He was also someone who could not entirely silence his conscience about what those problems were being used for, what those challenges were being solved in service of. The photograph he preserved was his attempt to answer a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. How do I maintain moral agency within a system designed to eliminate moral agency? How do I refuse complicity without sacrificing my own life? What are the costs of participation? What are the costs of refusal? How do I live with knowledge that I am participating in the machinery of violence? He did not answer these questions through grand resistance. He did not blow up facilities. He did not sabotage weapon systems in dramatic fashion. He did not sacrifice his life in a grand gesture of moral defiance against the system. Instead, he did something quieter and perhaps more complicated. He preserved evidence of his own consciousness. He created a photograph that testified to the fact that he knew what he was doing. He lived with that knowledge. He lived with that complicity. And he spent the rest of his life, 55 years after the war ended, attempting to ensure that future generations of technical professionals would think more carefully about these questions than he had been able to think about them in 1943. Klaus lived for 55 years after the war ended. 55 years of carrying the photograph beside his bed. 55 years of teaching engineering ethics. 55 years of attempting to construct meaning from the complicity he could not escape, could not undo, could not run away from. 55 years of working with young engineers, of helping them understand that technical problems cannot be separated from ethical dimensions, of teaching them that conscience matters, that individual choices matter, that you cannot simply solve an interesting problem while ignoring what that problem will be used for. What strikes me most profoundly about this photograph and the story it preserves is not primarily the documentation of Klaus's complicity in weapons development during the Second World War. That is undeniable. That is documented. That is part of the historical record. But what strikes me most powerfully is the documentation of his refusal to allow that complicity to define him entirely. He participated in the weapons program. That is undeniable and documented. But he also bore witness to his own participation. He created evidence. He created testimony. He created a question for the future. And then he spent the rest of his life attempting to answer that question by becoming a different kind of person than the weapons engineer of 1943. Not because he could escape the past, not because he could undo his participation, not because he could somehow absolve himself of guilt, but because he understood that even if you cannot undo the past, you can attempt to shape the future. You can teach. You can influence. You can ensure that the next generation thinks differently. The photograph endures now as public testimony to Klaus's complicity and to his attempt at atonement. When I encounter it, Klaus at his desk in March 1943, surrounded by evidence of his technical work in weapons development, his smile containing layers of internal conflict, I am confronted with questions about my own participation in systems I may not fully approve of. I am confronted with the reality that ordinary people participated in extraordinary systems of violence. I am confronted with the recognition that Klaus knew what he was doing, that he had choices even if those choices all carried severe costs. Klaus lived quietly in Boston for 48 years after the war. He taught engineering and ethics. He married and had children and grandchildren. He apparently found peace, or at minimum, found a way to live with the absence of peace, found a way to construct a meaningful life despite carrying the burden of wartime complicity. His students spoke of him as one of the most influential teachers they had encountered. They spoke of how his insistence on ethical consciousness had shaped their careers, had influenced their choices, had made them think differently about technical work than they would have otherwise thought. What Klaus accomplished through his teaching cannot undo what he did at Peenemünde. The V-2 rockets that his guidance systems helped develop killed thousands of people. That damage cannot be repaired. That complicity cannot be erased. But what Klaus accomplished was to ensure that his participation in that system of violence would be paired throughout his life, and continuing after his death through the revelation of this photograph and his story, with a commitment to ensuring that others would think differently, would choose differently, would refuse complicity in ways that he was not able to refuse. The photograph asks this of all of us. It asks, in systems designed to eliminate moral consciousness, what choices do I have? How do I maintain conscience? How do I refuse complicity without sacrificing everything? And if I have been complicit, as all of us are complicit in systems of violence to some degree, whether through military-industrial participation, environmental destruction, or systematic exploitation, how do I live with that complicity? How do I attempt to atone? Klaus died in 1998 without answering these questions. Completely. Perhaps they cannot be answered completely. Perhaps all we can do is what Klaus did: bear witness to our own consciousness, preserve evidence of our knowledge, attempt to teach future generations to think differently, and live with the profound discomfort of knowing that we have participated in systems we did not fully approve of, but did not fully resist either. Some photographs capture more than faces. They capture the moment when someone chooses to make their own complicity visible. They preserve evidence that ordinary people knew what they were doing, understood the consequences, and made choices. Choices that involved participation, survival, and the persistent attempt to atone through different kinds of work and different kinds of living. Klaus Hoffmann's photograph is that kind of image. It documents complicity, but it also documents consciousness. It also documents the possibility that even within totalitarian systems designed to eliminate individual agency, individuals can preserve their own consciousness of what they are participating in. They can create testimony. They can preserve evidence. They can spend the rest of their lives attempting to ensure that the next generation thinks more carefully, chooses more courageously, and refuses more completely than they were able to refuse. The smile on Klaus's face in this photograph is not the smile of someone celebrating his participation in weapons development. It is the smile of someone performing confidence and professional competence while internally wrestling with profound moral conflict. It is evidence of someone attempting to maintain composure, maintain professional appearance, maintain his role, while being aware of the essential wrongness of what he is doing. And in preserving this photograph, in creating evidence of his own consciousness, in spending 48 years teaching ethics to hundreds of engineering students, Klaus Hoffmann asked the rest of us to consider, what is my complicity? What systems am I participating in? What evidence do I need to preserve about my own consciousness? What will I teach future generations about the relationship between technical work and ethical responsibility? These are the questions the photograph preserves. These are the questions history entrusts to us. And in confronting them, we honor not only Klaus's struggle, but the struggle of all ordinary people who have found themselves complicit in extraordinary systems of violence and who have attempted, however imperfectly, to atone and to teach and to ensure that the future thinks differently.